The moon didn't crack, it folded, quietly, under its own forgotten weight. Once, it had been a satellite archive for a species that had no word for death, only translation. Now it hung above Frau 4 like a worn-out coin, riddled with collapses and ivy-like metal rot. When excavation crews from the Versen Institute finally breached its central vault, they expected little beyond the usual relics, language disks, preservation jars, ossified mines stored in resin. Instead, they found the spiral. It rested in the middle of a spherical chamber with no seams, perched on a pedestal like it had been waiting. No dust coated its coiled surface. No corrosion marred the tiny inscriptions etched across its countless loops. It resembled a scroll made of translucent crystal, wound impossibly tight, glowing faintly from within, as if lit by memory, not light. Hollis Venn leaned over it, his breath rasping faintly through his prosthetic larynx. His eyes, one organic, the other ink-black and mechanical, tracked the etchings as his gloved fingers traced them without touching. Language, he murmured, voice dry and modulated. But not linear. The assistant archaeologist, a nervous alien hybrid named Volek, blinked sideways with both sets of eyelids. What do you mean? It doesn't read from left to right, or in spirals. It moves, temporally. Like it's mapping events through time, not space. Like a history? No. Like a path. Hollis unlatched the data module from his forearm and fed the first set of etchings into his private translator, a spindly device whose syntax engine had once decoded the underwater glyphs of Zev Merrill. After a moment's hesitation, the device pulsed once. The translation read, "Begin where memory is weakest. Follow through loss." Others would have dismissed it as religious babble. Hollis didn't. He spent that night alone in the chamber, manually transcribing the rest of the spiral into his own private language grid, bypassing the Institute's upload protocols. Outside, Volek and the others argued over the cultural origin of the artifact, but Hollis wasn't interested in culture. He was interested in resonance, the thread of logic that connected ideas across civilizations that had never met. By the time the twin sons of Frau 4 crawled above the ruins, Hollis had marked 8 coordinate patterns embedded in the spiral's deeper layers. Each formed part of a non-Euclidean loop. And each seemed to correspond to gravitational anomalies previously dismissed by most astronomers as sensor drift or interference. He transmitted a single encrypted message to an old acquaintance on Dranar Station, a mechanic named Sale with a fondness for antique engines and less fondness for questions. Then he requisitioned his ship from drydock. The acanthus red was no marvel. It was lopsided, scarred along its lower hull, and ran on patched-together fusion arrays cannibalized from cargo haulers. But it had one crucial feature, a functional probability engine. The only kind capable of plotting paths through spacetime when coordinates weren't entirely real. By the time Sale docked and stomped aboard, dragging a stubborn duffel bag and a mug of synth brew, Hollis had already preloaded the map's coordinates into the NAV system. "What mess have you dragged me into now?" Sale muttered, tossing the bag onto a bench with a grunt. "A pilgrimage," Hollis said. Sale stopped mid-sip. "You're joking." Hollis didn't blink. The ship's lights dimmed, engines murmuring to life. Navigation plotted its course in uncertain vectors, guided not by known star charts but by the etchings of a spiral that should not exist. Frau 4 shrank behind them. The stars ahead twitched. And the first waypoint blinked into view, like an eye half awake. The acanthus red arrived at the coordinates without fanfare. No gravity well, no stellar body, only a ghostly ring of metal orbiting a cold, withered star that barely had the strength to flicker. The ring structure spanned thousands of kilometers, composed of latticed struts and radial corridors, all silent, all intact despite the obvious abandonment. Sail stood behind the navigation console, chewing a strip of dried root as if it were an act of defiance. No heat signatures. No biosigns. Just old bones. Hollis pressed 2 fingers to the side of his skull, syncing his ocular implant with the ship's scan feed. Scan again. This place isn't dead. It wasn't. Not quite. The ship's external sensors weren't detecting motion, but they were receiving low-frequency pulses, vibrations through vacuum, impossible in principle but present all the same. Not sound, but patterned silence. Like static that had decided to organize itself. Kep, their vat-housed crew member, gurgled inside its tank near the aft hatch. Its gelatinous form shifted as it spoke through the vocal proxy. This structure transmits non-auditory resonance. It's not speaking to us, it's echoing from us. A reply. A reply to what? Sail muttered. No one answered. Docking required manual override. As they approached, the ship's probability engine stuttered, confused by the geometry of the ring. Up close, the lattice didn't align properly, angles bent subtly inward, lengths mismatched despite identical measurements. Hollis called it a perception trap. Kep called it architectural dissonance. The airlock hissed, then opened without resistance. No atmosphere inside, but no decay either. Walls were etched with a mineral that shimmered under low light like aged copper. They moved through corridors flanked by frozen statues, beings kneeling, standing, arms raised in silence. Each one faced the center. The chamber at the ring's core resembled a temple, though no doctrine hung on the walls. In place of an altar stood a raised platform, surrounded by 12 carved figures, humanoid in shape, faceless, each different in stance and size. The positioning suggested ceremony. The wear of the floor tiles suggested repetition. A faded hum rolled through their suits. Not heard, registered. Is it a recording? Sail asked. No. It's current, Hollis said. Live. But not language. Kep floated closer, extending a soft pseudopod toward the platform. At its touch, the room did not activate. There were no moving parts, no lights, but their suits registered a shift. The vibrations focused. The silence became shaped. And then came the phrase. It didn't arrive through ears. It didn't even arrive through language. It was simply there, in their heads, translated instantly by their own minds as if it had always existed. We waited. You came too late. Hollis staggered back, but his face didn't change. Who is we? The silence deepened, and for a moment, it felt like the room considered him. Then nothing. No further messages. No threats. No requests. They returned to the acanthus, each haunted by different questions. Kep was first to break the quiet. This was a relay station. Not built to teach. Built to remember. Remember what? Sail said. Hollis stared out at the ring structure, now dim and still. Not what, he said. When? The map of WYRMS rotated slowly on the console, its etched spirals catching stray starlight. A new set of coordinates glowed faintly where there had been none before. The next waypoint awaited. Not forward. Inward. The second set of coordinates on the map led them to an anomaly that registered as a null point in star charts, an empty section of space where gravity fluctuated irrationally and long-range scans returned fractured data. But as the acanthus red dropped out of fold space, the anomaly unfolded. A structure hung there, vast and impossible, floating in orbit around nothing. It looked like a cathedral that had been built from the remnants of derelict vessels, freighters, escape pods, fighter hulls, and even orbital habitats, all fused together by methods neither mechanical nor organic. Some pieces were charred, others pristine. None matched in origin. Sail leaned forward in his chair. This wasn't built. It was gathered. The acanthus approached under minimal thrust. Hollis let the ship drift close, then engaged the stabilizers to hold orbit. The vessel's AI refused to lock onto the structure, its sensors unable to resolve a consistent outline. To most systems, it wasn't there. But to the crew, it loomed. They entered through a gaping aperture at what might have once been the rear of a long-forgotten passenger ship. Inside, gravity felt variable, strong near the ceiling, light along the walls. The central hall stretched forward like a spinal column, arched and hollow, branching off into narrow galleries. Hollis paused before a row of seated figures. Their forms were intact but motionless, cloaked in armor, bones, or what might have once been cloth. Their heads were bowed, hands clasped. There were no offerings, no symbols. Just the posture of reverence. "Worshippers?" Sale asked. "No altar," Hollis murmured. "And no object of focus." Further in, they found it, a central dais surrounded by ringed steps, raised above a floor inscribed with lines that pulsed gently beneath their feet, strange, radial designs that flickered in their peripheral vision but vanished when stared at directly. Atop the dais was a hollow indentation. Shallow, precise. A space that asked to be filled. Kep hovered near it, the surface of its vat swirling with anxiety patterns. "I recognize this," it said. "Not from knowledge, from resonance." Before Hollis could question it, Kep extended a filament from its containment chamber, dipping a single tendril into the indentation. For an instant, the entire cathedral lit. Not with light. With memory. Each crew member found themselves elsewhere, standing on alien soil, beneath a sky with 3 suns, or breathing underwater without lungs, or walking across ash plains under a flickering aurora. Each vision different. Each impossible. Yet all shared the same undercurrent, loss. When they snapped back to themselves, the cathedral was silent again. The indentation was gone, sealed over by smooth metal. Hollis stood at the edge of the dais, one hand trembling slightly. He didn't speak of what he'd seen. But he pulled out the spiral again, and sure enough, a new vector had formed in its depths, one that wasn't part of the original loop. The map was rewriting itself. Sale broke the silence. If that was a temple, then what did we just give it? Hollis didn't meet his eyes. A piece. A piece of what? But Hollis was already turning back to the ship. Their fourth destination was unlike the others, not a structure or relic, but a field. The acanthus red dropped into real space at the edge of a system where physics collapsed on itself every 12 minutes. Ahead of them, a space-time pocket rippled like heat above stone. Satellites launched by other expeditions still drifted at the boundary, their signal logs frozen mid-transmission, never aging yet never stable. Kep drifted near the observation deck, processing sensor data faster than the ship's AI. "This region repeats," it said. "The loop doesn't only affect movement, it resets probability. Memory won't function beyond a threshold." "Then how do we get through?" Sale asked. Hollis pointed to the faint dot orbiting the edge of the distortion. It was another ship, torn down the middle, blackened along the hull, its antennae frozen in a spread pattern like reaching limbs. The identification tag flickered briefly before resolution, acanthus red. "Is that?" Sale began. "Yes," Hollis said. The crew stared, silent. It was unmistakably their ship, older, battered, and riddled with breach scars. They docked cautiously, airlock to airlock, and crossed over with suits sealed tight. No bodies inside. Just silence and residual power from a reactor struggling to complete its final cycle. The log core sat intact. Inside it, the final entry from Hollis Venn played back in his own voice, hoarse, urgent, and filled with something none of them could name. "We came through 57 times. Each path led back here. Memory loops. Choices unwind. And yet, the map changes, slightly, with each loop. I think it's learning from our forgetting. If we're to move forward, we can't bring our memories with us. We must erase what brought us here." Kep's tendrils pulsed blue, uncertain. "Self-inflicted amnesia?" "Partial," Hollis said. Enough to bypass the reset. Sale raised an eyebrow. And who exactly programs that? I already have. They returned to their version of the Acanthus, and Hollis activated a protocol buried deep in the ship's neural cache, a virus of sorts, engineered to surgically remove memories tied to the map's first 3 coordinates. The only record left would be what the spiral chose to retain. Hollis looked over the crew before the activation. "You won't forget who you are," he said. "But you won't remember how you knew to care." He triggered the process. The lights dimmed. The ship buckled once, then settled. Silence blanketed the bridge, not from loss, but from uncertainty unmoored. Then the navigation console pulsed once, unprompted. A new path appeared. Unlike the others, this one didn't thread through stellar bodies. It cut between them, through a corridor of nothingness mapped by no sensor and charted by no species. They followed it. As they left the mirrored field behind, the copy of the Acanthus Red collapsed inward, folding into its own engines before vanishing without trace. No one looked back. Space twisted as they entered the corridor. Not in direction, but in form. Stars smeared like oil across water, shapes moved independently of time, and the usual rules that guided sensors broke apart before they even finished rendering. Navigation became metaphor. The ship moved not to avoid obstacles, but to align with intentions. The Acanthus Red groaned under the strain. Its hull flexed, not against gravity or thrust, but against concepts too large for matter to carry. "Status?" Hollis asked, though he barely heard his own voice. Kep's speech modulator clicked, slowed. "The corridor isn't mapped on the spiral. It's responding. To us." Colors filled the viewport, hues that didn't correspond to any known wavelength, tones that made no logical sense and yet meant something. Pale violets carried regret. A burnt yellow drifted past, humming with memory. A deep, impossible green pressed against the ship's perimeter, and Sale turned away as if it had whispered his name. Lights flickered, and then the corridor opened. Not into a planet or void, but into what looked like a breach in the universe's texture, an enormous tear, framed by a lattice of fractured geometry. They passed through, and on the other side waited a form. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a creature. It simply was. A presence that didn't impose, but instead allowed others to notice it. Its appearance shifted with perception. What Hollis saw was different from what Sale saw, and Kep's sensors refused to interpret it at all. But they all understood it. It was not an emissary. It was a question. Without speaking, without gesture, it asked. Not in words. In essence. To Sale, the message was, "What price is purpose?" To Kep, "If you become the vessel, who steers?" To Hollis, "Will you carry what others erased?" Hollis stepped forward. No one else moved. He took the spiral from its containment case. It pulsed gently in his hand, the etchings rotating on their own, symbols reconfiguring like living circuits. Then, with no instruction, Hollis extended it toward the presence. The spiral unraveled, not in motion, but in implication. Each coil separated, suspended midair. The being leaned, not physically, but within the structure of possibility, and read the map without touching it. Then it released them. The lattice behind the breach folded away. A new vector formed in their navigation system. This one didn't just cross stars, it intersected timelines, coordinates stamped with designations long out of use, referencing constellations whose names had not been spoken for millennia. The presence faded without parting words. It hadn't needed any. Sale let out a breath through his teeth. "What did we just meet?" Hollis turned, slowly winding the spiral back into its case. "Something that never wanted to be found," he said. "But had to be witnessed." The Acanthus turned, the new path unfolding ahead, a trail line not with stars, but with echoes. They followed. The sixth jump dropped the Acanthus Red into the center of a stellar grave. Planets, at least 8 of them, drifted in perfect alignment around a collapsed singularity, each one locked in orbit by an equilibrium that should not have held. The central mass didn't emit radiation, gravity, or even shadow. It simply existed, unmoving and unmeasured. The planets were wrong in another way: their surfaces hadn't decayed. No asteroid scarring. No erosion. No weather. It was as if time had passed through them without leaving a trace. The crew drifted in low orbit around the third sphere from the singularity. Initial scans showed an atmosphere, breathable but static. Hollis led the descent party, himself, Sail, and a drone tethered to Kep's consciousness node. They landed near a ruin. The city, if it had ever truly been one, stood quiet beneath twin arcs of crystalline structures. Towers with fused windows and bridges that connected nothing. Buildings seemed abandoned mid-thought, their walls imprinted with symbols that pulsed under ultraviolet light. Sail brushed a hand across one of the walls. "I know this design." "You shouldn't," Hollis said. "No, I do. These look like the schematic motifs used on early Terran colonies. Pre-expansion." Hollis approached a plinth at the center of the courtyard. A familiar symbol was etched into it, a six-pointed spiral, identical to the one on the map of WYRMS. And beside it, something more unsettling, a date. Not a local timekeeping system, but a Gregorian standard timestamp. 38,977,042 AD. Kep's drone word, translating the surrounding inscriptions. These structures are human. Or at least patterned after human cognitive geometry. The builders wrote in future tense imperatives. "What kind of imperatives?" Sail asked. "Instructions for survival. Warnings about recursion." And, the drone paused. "Mentions of the map. By name." Hollis exhaled slowly, voice barely audible. "We're walking through the shadow of a timeline that hasn't happened yet." He turned in a slow circle, taking in the scene. Towers reaching for nothing. Streets no feet had touched in eons. Echoes of people who had never yet existed. "Maybe this pilgrimage doesn't lead to a place," Sail said. "Maybe it leads to what becomes of us." They explored deeper, finding data nodes embedded in walls, memory cores overgrown with crystal that refracted their own faces wrong. The final node was sealed beneath a dome, the interior showing a star map where everything was wrong. Familiar constellations twisted out of place. Stars marked, absent. Whole sectors labeled uninhabitable by recursion decay. "Is this prophecy?" Sail asked, voice low. "No," Hollis said. "Recordings. From something after us. After everything." Kep's drone hovered near the dome center, where a console blinked once. Then another time. A new set of coordinates appeared. One last vector. The path spiraled inward, directly toward the galactic center. As the acanthus rose back into orbit, Sail remained quiet until the ship began aligning for jump. "What kind of pilgrimage ends at the end of time?" Hollis stared at the map. "One that never ends." They followed the last vector through stretches of space where even light refused to travel in straight lines. The acanthus red groaned more with idea than with mass, as if the structure of the vessel resisted being remembered in the place they were headed. There was no galactic center, not in any traditional sense. No black hole, no singularity churning stars into dust. The coordinates pointed to a patch of vacuum where everything had once begun, but no longer had any need to remain. The ship's systems lost their grip on direction. Instruments blinked nonsense. Time, once tight and linear, loosened into layers. And still the spiral rotated. Inside the crew's minds, first faintly, then with force, memories surfaced that weren't their own. Sail saw a city he'd never built dissolve beneath a sky torn by soundless lightning. Kep recalled being many instead of one, scattered across vats in 10 different systems, all learning to forget at once. Hollis stood in a childhood corridor that never existed, running his fingers over peeling paint that whispered warnings only he could hear. At last, the ship passed through. Not into another system. Into state. No stars. No space. Only presence. Not singular. Not multiple. A consciousness layered across thought itself. It didn't observe them. It had no need. It was already part of them, an echo folded into their neural structure, buried since the start of the voyage, perhaps since the start of all voyages. And in its stillness, it asked nothing. Instead, it remembered. The acanthus drifted inside this memory of origin. Not an event, not a beginning. A question, the first question. Why is there something, rather than nothing? The moment they understood it, they were no longer separate. The question lived in them, whispered behind every word they had ever spoken, stitched into the lines of every map they'd ever drawn. Hollis stood at the center of the ship's bridge, spiral open in his hands. Its coils unwrapped into threads of light, stretching outward until they vanished beyond the visible. He did not speak. There was nothing to add. The question had never wanted an answer. It had only wanted to be shared. Behind them, the path collapsed. Not violently, not abruptly. Just, quietly, as though its purpose had been fulfilled. Ahead, the spiral closed. The acanthus red emerged from the core with no event horizon, no dimensional rupture. One moment, the ship hung within a consciousness too vast to define. The next, stars blinked into view, familiar, but misaligned. Hollis stared at the NAV display. The constellations matched Terran patterns, but mirrored, fractured, rearranged. Systems they once knew appeared where voids had been. Coordinates returned nonsense. The galaxy hadn't just turned. It had rewritten its index. "This isn't our chart," Sale said. "It's close, but wrong." "No," Hollis replied quietly. "It's ours. We've just passed beyond the version we knew." The acanthus was intact. But changed. Its hull had inscriptions it didn't carry before, delicate script, etched along the inner seams, words from a language that hadn't been spoken yet. The spiral had fused with the mainframe. It no longer pulsed with destination but glowed faintly, like something sleeping after long labor. Kep hovered in the rear bay, silently processing. "We returned," it said at last. "But not to where we began. Or when." Hollis walked to the viewport. The planet below shimmered with atmosphere, forests tracing unfamiliar coastlines. Cities, but none he recognized. Technology that shimmered, but not with metal. A civilization that looked forward, but didn't forget. A transmission pinged the ship. It wasn't a hail. It was an invitation. Coordinates to land. A name. Not a name the crew recognized, but one that pulsed with memory. Sale looked at Hollis. "You think they've been waiting for us?" "No," Hollis answered. "I think we're part of how they got here." He made no move to descend. Instead, he transferred the spiral's last imprint into the ship's core log, sealed the acanthus red's guidance systems, and activated a protocol that would embed the vessel into the orbit of a dead moon nearby. Not destroyed. Not hidden. Placed. "Someone else will find her," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "The way we did." "And us?" Sale asked. "We walk," Hollis said. On the moon below, the crew stepped out beneath an unfamiliar sun. No alarms. No celebration. Just a horizon that shimmered with potential and a sense, not of ending, but of continuation. As if the pilgrimage had never been about arrival, but transfer. The silence they'd found at the center of everything had not been void. It had been listening. And now, it waited in others.